Have you ever heard of the bizarre fertility rituals practiced in isolated ranch towns? The traditions that no one talks about in polite society? Well, buckle up because you're about to dive into the shocking world of these practices through the eyes of Isabella Isa Martinez, a young anthropologist who discovered more than she bargained for. When she first arrived in the remote town of Redwater Creek, she had no idea that her research would uncover centuries-old fertility customs that would challenge everything she thought she knew about rural American culture. Isabella's journey began on a crisp autumn morning when she drove into Redwater Creek, population 827. The town looked like something straight out of an old Western film, with its wooden storefronts and dusty main street lined with pickup trucks. As a cultural anthropologist specializing in rural traditions, Isa was excited to document the harvest festival that supposedly had roots dating back to the early settlers. What the university brochures didn't mention was the festival's true nature, a fertility ritual with practices so unusual that locals kept them hidden from outsiders. Her professor had hinted that this town held unique cultural elements worth studying, but his knowing smile now made sense in a way that sent shivers down her spine. The locals welcomed her warmly enough, but there was something in their eyes, a guarded secret that seemed to pass between them whenever she mentioned the upcoming festival. Mrs. Jenkins, the owner of the only bed and breakfast in town, had given her a room with a view of the central square, where workers were already erecting a large wooden structure. "You're lucky to be here for the blessing," the older woman had said while handing Isa the room key. "Not many outsiders get to see it, and fewer understand what it truly means to this community." Carvings of pregnant women adorned doorways, and peculiar circular patterns were painted on fence posts and barn doors. These weren't the typical horseshoes or religious symbols you'd expect in a rural American town. When she asked about them at the local diner, the waitress, Sally, according to her name tag, merely smiled and said they were for good fortune. But Isa's trained eye recognized elements from ancient fertility cults, some dating back to pre-Christian Europe. How had these symbols found their way to a ranch town in the American heartland? And why were they still being used? The locals weren't exactly forthcoming with answers, changing the subject whenever she pressed too hard. The town sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Jim Harker, seemed particularly uncomfortable with her questions, his weathered face hardening whenever she pulled out her camera to document the symbols. "Some things ain't for outsiders to understand," he'd muttered when she photographed a peculiar stone arrangement at the edge of town. "Some traditions keep this land fertile, keep our cattle breeding and our crops growing. Been that way since my great-grandpappy's time, and we aim to keep it that way." The wooden structure in the town square was nearly complete now, and it reminded her of something she couldn't quite place, something she'd seen in her textbooks about ancient fertility rituals. The sound of boots on the wooden steps made her look up. A young man about her age stood there, hat in hand, looking somewhat nervous. "Name's Thomas Reeves," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Folks call me Tommy. Mrs. Jenkins said you were asking questions about our traditions." There was something in his expression, a mixture of pride and uncertainty, that made Isa think he might be a valuable informant. "I could show you some things," he continued, lowering his voice. "Things the others won't talk about. My grandma was the keeper of stories before she passed, and she didn't believe in keeping all our ways secret." Isa closed her notebook, intrigued by this unexpected opportunity. What Tommy would show her over the next few days would both fascinate and disturb her, challenging her academic detachment and forcing her to question the line between cultural observation and participation. The bizarre fertility practices of Redwater Creek were about to be revealed, layer by unsettling layer. Tommy took Isa to an old barn on the outskirts of town the following morning. The structure looked ordinary enough from the outside, but inside, hidden beneath loose floorboards, was a small chamber containing artifacts that made Isa's academic heart race. "These belong to the oldest families," Tommy explained, as she carefully examined clay figurines of women with exaggerated reproductive features. "They bring them out for the blessing ceremony, but the rest of the year, they stay hidden." The figurines were remarkably similar to ancient Venus statues found in archaeological sites across Europe, but with distinctive modifications that suggested local adaptation. Some had cattle horns integrated into their design, while others held what appeared to be wheat or corn. "My grandma said our ancestors brought these from the old country," Tommy continued, gently handling a particularly worn statue. "They believed the power of these mother figures would make the new land accept them, make it fertile for their crops and cattle." Isa carefully photographed each artifact, noting the similarities to both European pagan traditions and Native American fertility symbols. It was as if the isolated community had created a unique hybrid ritual system, preserving elements from multiple sources while adapting them to their specific needs. "And people still believe in these?" she asked, trying to keep the academic skepticism from her voice. Tommy's expression grew serious. "The year Reverend Mills convinced folks to skip the ceremony, we lost half our cattle to disease and the crops withered in the fields. Worst drought in living memory. Nobody questions it anymore." Martha was initially reluctant to speak with an outsider, but Tommy's endorsement and Isa's genuine interest eventually won her over. "The land must be fed," Martha explained as she showed Isa a small wooden box containing what looked like ordinary seeds mixed with something red. "Just as a man plants his seed in a woman to create life, we must plant properly prepared seeds in the earth." The old woman's matter-of-fact tone made the ritual sound perfectly reasonable, but Isa's academic mind was cataloging the obvious sexual symbolism and blood ritual components. Martha explained how young women of the community would collect their menstrual blood during the year, mixing it with specific herbs and seeds for the planting ritual. "The blood of life returns to the soil," she said simply. "Been that way since before my grandmother's time." Isa struggled to maintain her professional demeanor, reminding herself that many cultures throughout history had connected female fertility with agricultural success. But the living practice of such a ritual in modern-day America was unprecedented in her research experience. "And everyone participates in this?" she asked carefully, wondering how such practices could remain hidden from the wider world. Martha's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Town folk have their ways. Ranch folk have ours. Some traditions stay within certain families, but the blessing brings us all together." The local church, a white-steepled building that could have been on any small-town postcard, incorporated subtle fertility symbols into its architecture and Sunday services. Pastor Williams, a friendly middle-aged man who'd welcomed her to town, delivered sermons that skillfully blended Christian teachings with much older concepts. "The seed falling on fertile ground," he'd preached the Sunday Isa attended, "brings forth life, 30, 60, 100-fold. God blesses those who prepare the soil properly." The congregation had nodded in understanding, exchanging glances that clearly held deeper meaning. After the service, Isa noticed several older women collecting specific herbs from the church garden, carefully placing them in cloth pouches embroidered with those same ancient symbols she'd been documenting. When she asked Tommy about it later, he explained that these herbs would be part of the bridal preparation for any weddings in the coming year. "For fertility," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "The brides drink a tea made from those herbs for 7 days before the wedding. Ensures the marriage will be fruitful." Isa couldn't help wondering what exactly was in those herbal preparations, and whether the young brides fully understood the pagan origins of their pre-wedding ritual. As the day of the blessing ceremony drew closer, the town's energy noticeably shifted. Farmers brought their best livestock to be prepared for the ritual, a process that involved painting specific symbols on the animals' bodies and feeding them specially grown grains. Women gathered to bake breads in shapes that made Isa blush despite her academic detachment, clearly phallic loaves that would be distributed during the ceremony. Children were taught special dances that, to Isa's trained eye, mimicked ancient fertility movements, though the kids clearly thought they were just fun harvest games. One afternoon, she observed teenage boys constructing what Tommy called seed sticks, carved wooden rods decorated with feathers, horsehair, and leather straps. "For the young men's part of the ceremony," he explained vaguely, seeming uncomfortable for the first time since he'd begun showing her the town's traditions. The wooden structure in the town square was now complete, and Isa finally recognized what it resembled: a combination of maypole and ancient fertility altar, with spaces that seemed designed for offerings. Sheriff Harker watched her closely whenever she sketched or photographed the structure, his expression unreadable but his presence a constant reminder that she was an outsider being granted unusual access. "You've been asking a lot of questions," he said when he caught her measuring the altar's dimensions. "Tommy seems to think you're trustworthy. For his sake, I hope that's true." Unlike typical small-town pageants, this selection process involved no public competition or voting. Instead, the older women of the community gathered in Martha's home, brewing a special tea and discussing each eligible young woman in hushed tones. "The queen must be at her most fertile time during the ceremony," Martha explained when Isa asked about the selection criteria, "and she must be pure, Never having borne a child before, Isa was shocked to realize that the women were tracking the menstrual cycles of the town's young women, determining who would be at the peak of fertility during the festival. The implications were both fascinating from an anthropological perspective and disturbing from a modern ethical standpoint. The chosen girl, Katie Miller, a shy 17-year-old, seemed both honored and nervous when she was informed of her selection. "It's a blessing," her mother assured her, though Isa noted the worry lines around the woman's eyes. "Your grandmother was harvest queen in her day, and your father was born 9 months later." Katie would be given special foods in the days leading up to the ceremony, and would wear a dress handed down through generations, embroidered with symbols Isa now recognized as representing fertility, abundance, and protection. What exactly would be expected of the harvest queen during the ceremony? Tommy became evasive when she asked directly, merely saying that Katie would help ensure a good harvest for the coming year. The academic part of her was thrilled to document living fertility rituals that had survived into the modern era, practices that had clearly been passed down for generations, while evolving to incorporate elements from multiple cultural sources. But the human part of her worried about what exactly would happen at tomorrow's ceremony, particularly regarding Katie's role as harvest queen. From her window she could see lights in the town square, where final preparations were being made under the watchful eye of Sheriff Harker. The wooden structure now held offerings, fresh produce, handmade objects, and something that looked disturbingly like blood dripping from clay bowls. A soft knock at her door startled her. Tommy stood in the hallway, his expression more serious than she'd seen before. "You need to know what you're getting into tomorrow," he said quietly. "Once you attend the blessing, you're part of it, not just watching anymore." He handed her a small cloth bag containing what felt like seeds or small stones. "Keep this with you tomorrow, for protection." Before she could ask what she needed protection from, he continued, "The outsiders who've seen our ways before, they either become part of our community, or they—" He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging heavily in the air between them. "Just promise you'll keep an open mind. What looks strange to outsiders has kept this land fertile and our people prosperous for generations." With that cryptic warning, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as Isa stood frozen, the small bag clutched in her suddenly trembling hand. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn day that belied the tension Isa felt as she prepared to witness the culmination of Redwater Creek's fertility traditions. The town was transformed, homes decorated with corn husks and wheat sheaves, doorways marked with fresh symbols drawn in what looked like red clay, and everyone dressed in their finest clothes with subtle embroidered symbols now familiar to Isa's trained eye. Children ran excitedly through the streets while adults made final preparations with solemn purpose. Tommy came to escort her to the ceremony, dressed in a white shirt with special leather suspenders that marked him as one of the seed bearers, young men with a specific role in the ritual. "Stay close to me," he advised as they walked toward the town square where crowds were already gathering. "Once things start, it's important that you follow along. Don't stand apart or draw attention to yourself." Isa clutched her notebook and camera, determined to document everything while heeding Tommy's warning. The small protection bag he'd given her was tucked into her pocket, a constant reminder of his ominous words the night before. As they approached the square, she saw Katie being led by a procession of older women, the girl's face partially covered by a veil, embroidered with the now familiar fertility symbols. The sheriff nodded curtly at Isa as she passed, his eyes communicating a clear message. "Watch if you must, but do not interfere." The beating of drums began, slow and rhythmic like a heartbeat, as the townsfolk formed a circle around the wooden structure that now seemed to pulse with significance in the morning light. The ceremony began with Pastor Williams offering what sounded like a traditional Christian prayer, but Isa recognized the subtle references to seed-finding fertile ground and the joining that brings forth abundance for what they really were. Thinly veiled fertility invocations far older than Christianity. The crowd responded with practiced phrases, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made it easy to get caught up in the collective energy. 4 older women, including Tommy's Aunt Martha, approached the wooden structure carrying clay bowls containing mixtures Isa had learned were made from specific herbs, grains, and bodily fluids collected throughout the year. Each bowl was placed at a cardinal direction point on the structure, with Martha reciting what sounded like an incantation at each placement. "Earth receives our offering," the crowd chanted in response. "Blood returns to soil, seed to furrow, life to life. The ritual continued with young children performing their special dances around the structure, scattering prepared seeds in carefully choreographed patterns. Isa noticed that despite the seemingly archaic nature of the ceremony, nothing had yet occurred that would truly scandalize outside observers. It could easily be explained away as quaint harvest traditions, if any strangers happened upon them. But Tommy's tense posture beside her suggested that the truly significant parts were yet to come. "The next part is only for community members," he whispered, taking her elbow to guide her closer to the inner circle. "By bringing you here, I'm vouching that you're one of us now." The young harvest queen stood on a raised platform, arms outstretched as Martha and the other older women removed her outer garments, revealing a simple white shift underneath, embroidered with red symbols over the abdomen and breast areas. "She who receives the blessing carries it for all," the crowd chanted as the young men designated as seed bearers, including Tommy, formed a circle around the structure. Each carried one of the carved seed sticks Isa had seen them preparing. What followed was a ritual that symbolically enacted fertilization, the young men taking turns approaching the altar, touching their seed sticks to bowls of mixed grain and liquid before presenting them to Katie, who would select one to place in a central vessel on the altar. Isa realized with both academic fascination and personal discomfort that this was essentially a ritual selection of a symbolic mate, though nothing explicitly sexual occurred in front of the crowd. The chosen seed stick belonged to a young rancher named Michael, who stepped forward to stand beside Katie as the community cheered. "The blessing is chosen," Pastor Williams announced, as though this pagan selection process were as natural as announcing the winner of a church raffle. Martha approached the pair with a special cup containing what Isa knew to be the fertility mixture: herbs, honey, and symbolic bodily fluids that had been prepared over the previous month. Katie and Michael both drank from it before pouring the remainder into the soil at the base of the altar. The ceremony shifted again as Sheriff Harker stepped forward, his role apparently changing from watchful guardian to ritual participant. He carried a small lamb, adorned with ribbons and painted symbols, to the altar. Isa tensed, wondering if she was about to witness an animal sacrifice, but instead, the sheriff merely pricked the lamb's ear with a ceremonial knife, collecting a few drops of blood in a special bowl. "First blood of innocence freely given," he intoned, mixing the blood with soil from local fields. The mixture was used to mark Katie and Michael's foreheads and hands with specific symbols, binding them together in what Isa recognized as a temporary ritual marriage. "Until the seed shows fruit," Pastor Williams announced, placing his hands on the couple's heads in a gesture that seamlessly blended Christian blessing with pagan fertility rite. The community responded with a rhythmic chant that built in intensity until the entire town seemed to vibrate with collective purpose. Isa found herself swaying slightly, caught up in the hypnotic effect despite her academic observer's mindset. Tommy's hand on her arm steadied her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that asked a silent question. Was she merely documenting this ritual, or becoming part of it? The boundary between observer and participant had never felt so thin, and Isa realized with a start that the community was watching her reactions as carefully as she was watching their ceremony. Her acceptance or rejection of their practices seemed suddenly important in ways she hadn't anticipated when she first arrived in Redwater Creek with her notebooks and camera. The final part of the public ceremony involved the distribution of the specially prepared breads and foods to everyone present, the community literally consuming the symbols of fertility and abundance. Isa accepted a piece of the distinctly shaped bread when it was offered, aware that refusing would mark her as an outsider at this critical moment. The bread tasted sweeter than normal, with hints of herbs she couldn't identify. "Eating together seals our bond," Tommy explained quietly as everyone consumed their portion. "What happens next is more private, just Katie and Michael and the elders." As the crowd began to disperse, heading toward long tables set up for the community feast that would follow, Isa noticed Martha leading the ritual couple toward a small building adjacent to the church. Their faces showed a mixture of solemnity and nervous anticipation that made Isa wonder exactly what private rituals would follow. "Will they?" she began to ask Tommy, not quite able to formulate the question directly. He shook his head slightly. "Not what you're thinking. They'll spend the night in the blessing house, but separately. It's about symbolic union, not actual consummation. At least not yet." He lowered his voice further. "Though many harvest queens and their chosen partners do end up married within the year, the community expects it. Sheriff Harker approached them before Issa could ask more questions, his expression serious but less hostile than before. "You've seen our ways now," he said directly to Issa. "Seen how we keep this land fertile and our community strong. The question is, what do you plan to do with that knowledge?" As an anthropologist, she had a professional obligation to document and share significant cultural findings, and these living fertility rituals certainly qualified. But she also understood the community's desire for privacy, their fear that outsiders would misunderstand or even condemn practices that had sustained them for generations. "I'm here to learn, not to judge," she finally answered, choosing her words carefully. "What happens in Redwater Creek should be decided by its people." Something in her response seemed to satisfy the sheriff, whose stern expression softened slightly. "Tommy vouches for you, and he's got good instincts about people." He glanced at the young man standing protectively close to Issa. His grandmother was the same way. Could always tell who would understand our ways and who wouldn't. The implication was clear. Issa had been assessed from the moment she arrived, her reactions tested, her worthiness to receive their secrets evaluated at every step. The realization sent a shiver down her spine that wasn't entirely academic interest. "The feast is starting," Tommy said, breaking the tension. "You'll want to see how the ritual continues through the celebration." As they walked toward the long tables laden with food, Issa noticed that specific dishes were placed in particular patterns, the serving itself part of the ongoing fertility ritual. Nothing in this community was as simple or as modern as it had first appeared. The feast following the blessing ceremony revealed yet another layer of Redwater Creek's fertility traditions, one that connected food, community bonds, and reproductive symbolism in fascinating ways. Certain dishes were served only to married couples, while others were reserved for young unmarried women, or men of seeding age, as Tommy discreetly explained. Children received special honey cakes shaped like animals, representing the livestock the community depended on. Issa observed how seating arrangements followed specific patterns, with newly married couples placed near the Harvest Queen and her chosen partner, as if proximity might transfer fertility blessing to them. "My research never prepared me for anything like this," Issa confessed to Tommy as they sampled the ritual foods. These practices combine elements from so many different traditions: European pagan rituals, Native American ceremonies, even early Christian symbolism, but they've evolved into something completely unique to this community. Tommy nodded, pleased by her understanding. "My grandmother used to say our ways were like a patchwork quilt, pieces from all the different people who settled here, stitched together to keep us warm and safe." The metaphor was apt, Issa thought, watching the community celebrate with genuine joy and connection. Despite the aspects that might seem strange or even disturbing to outsiders, there was no denying that these shared rituals created powerful bonds among the people of Redwater Creek. The young folks who leave for college or jobs in the city, many of them come back for the blessing every year, Sheriff Harker commented, having joined them with a plate of food. "Something about these traditions keeps pulling them home." The ritual's influence extended beyond the symbolic union of Katie and Michael, apparently encouraging courtship and potential matches throughout the town. "The blessing season is when most couples start their courtships," Tommy explained when she commented on this pattern. "Something about the ritual makes people feel ready to connect." There was a hint of something personal in his tone that made Issa glance at him with new awareness. Had he been showing her his community's secrets for purely educational reasons, or was there another motivation behind his openness with her? The thought was both flattering and concerning. She was here as a researcher after all, not as a potential convert to their fertility practices. Yet she couldn't deny the powerful effect of the day's events, the way the ceremony had resonated on some primal level despite her academic detachment. As darkness fell completely, small groups began breaking away from the main feast, heading to more private celebrations in homes around town. "The fertility blessing continues in more personal ways now," Tommy said quietly, his implication clear. "Some traditions are passed down within families or between close friends." Issa noted that many of the older community members remained at the feast, ensuring that younger participants departed in appropriate pairings or groups. Even in their most private celebrations, there seemed to be an unspoken structure guiding who could participate and how. A complex social choreography centered around ensuring the community's future fertility in all its forms. The following morning, Issa woke feeling strangely different, not simply because of what she had witnessed, but because of how her perception of Redwater Creek had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as an academic study of rural traditions had become an immersion in living practices that challenged her understanding of how ancient belief systems could survive and adapt in the modern world. Over breakfast at the bed and breakfast, Mrs. Jenkins treated her with new respect, serving her special herbal tea that Isa recognized as similar to what had been given to Katie before the ceremony. "For women's health," the older woman said with a meaningful nod. "Martha thought you might appreciate it." The gesture confirmed what Isa had suspected. She was no longer viewed as merely an outside observer, but as someone who had been initiated into at least the outer circle of their traditions. Tommy arrived as she was finishing her tea, his expression both eager and hesitant. "There's more I can show you if you're interested," he offered. "Things we only share with people who've participated in the blessing." And there it was. The acknowledgement that by eating the ritual bread, by witnessing the ceremony, by not running away in shock or disgust, she had crossed a line from observer to participant. The anthropologist in her knew she should maintain professional distance, but another part of her, a part she hadn't fully acknowledged until now, was genuinely curious to go deeper, to understand not just the what of these practices, but the why. The protective bag Tommy had given her still sat in her pocket, a tangible reminder of her connection to this community and its ancient ways. "Show me," she heard herself say, setting aside her notebook for the first time since arriving in Redwater Creek. Some knowledge she was beginning to understand couldn't be captured in academic notes. Tommy led Isa to a place she hadn't yet explored, a small spring-fed pond on the outskirts of town, surrounded by ancient oak trees that must have been standing long before the first settlers arrived. "This is where it all began," he explained as they approached the water, which gleamed with unusual clarity in the morning light. "The original families settled here because of this spring. They believed the water had special properties that would make their livestock fertile and their crops abundant." Isa could see why the spot would have attracted attention. It had a natural serenity that felt almost sacred, the kind of place that might inspire spiritual connection in any culture. Ancient stone markers surrounded the pond, worn by time but still showing traces of carved symbols that matched those used in yesterday's ceremony. The native people who lived here before had their own rituals at this spring, Tommy continued, kneeling to touch the water reverently. "Our ancestors learned from them, combined their knowledge with the old ways they brought from Europe." This merging of traditions fascinated Isa from an academic perspective, but she was equally intrigued by the personal connection Tommy clearly felt to this place and its history. "My grandmother used to bring me here to teach me the stories," he said softly. She believed someone in each generation needed to remember how it all began, to keep the knowledge alive even as the world changed around us. He looked up at Isa with an expression that combined pride, uncertainty, and something more personal. "When she died, that responsibility passed to me." The community had adapted over time, finding ways to maintain their core beliefs while presenting a normal face to the outside world. "After the witch trials and religious persecution in the early days, our ancestors learned to hide their practices behind Christian facades," he explained as they sat beside the spring. "The church was built, but with our symbols hidden in the architecture. Prayers were said, but with our meanings woven into the words. This deliberate cultural camouflage had protected the community for generations, allowing them to practice their fertility rituals openly, yet invisibly, hiding in plain sight from outsiders who didn't know what to look for. But the most important knowledge is never written down," Tommy continued, his voice lowering despite the fact that they were alone. "The actual preparations for the fertility mixtures, the timing of certain rituals, the specific words to be spoken, those are passed down orally, from teacher to student." He hesitated, seeming to debate how much more to share. "My grandmother chose me to learn everything, not just the parts most community members know. She taught me things that even Sheriff Harker doesn't know, things only the keeper of traditions is supposed to understand." The implication was clear. Tommy held a special position in Redwater Creek, one that carried both privilege and burden, and for some reason, he had chosen to share that knowledge with Isa, an outsider with a camera and notebook. "There's something you should know about the blessing ceremony," Tommy said after they had sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the stone-lined edge of the spring. "What you saw yesterday, that's the public ritual, the one everyone participates in. But there's another level, a deeper ceremony that happens later." He explained that after the community feast, once most people had returned to their homes, a smaller group would gather at the spring, the Harvest Queen and her chosen partner, the elders who held specific roles, and those who had been selected to learn the inner traditions. They come here to complete the real blessing, he said, gesturing to a flat stone altar partially hidden among the trees. The ritual you witnessed is symbolic, but this one, he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with sharing this most private aspect of his community's practices. Issa waited patiently, not pushing but making it clear she was willing to hear whatever he felt able to share. Katie and Michael don't actually consummate the ritual, he finally continued. That's a misconception outsiders often have. Instead, they become vessels for something older, channels for fertility energy that's then distributed back to the community through the spring water. The concept aligned with ancient fertility practices Issa had studied academically, but the idea of such rituals being actively practiced in modern America was still astounding. "And this actually works?" she asked, careful to keep her tone curious rather than skeptical. Tommy's expression grew serious. "Every year the blessing is performed properly, our land stays fertile. The one year it wasn't, during my grandfather's time, disaster followed." But she couldn't deny the genuine belief Tommy and the others had in their practices, nor the undeniable fact that Redwater Creek was unusually prosperous compared to similar communities in the region. "There's power in traditions," Tommy said, seeming to read her thoughts, "not just because of what they might literally do to the soil or the livestock, but because they connect us to each other, to the land, to something bigger than ourselves." He reached into the clear spring water, letting it run through his fingers. "My grandmother used to say that beliefs are like seeds. They need the right conditions to grow, and once they take root, they create life of their own." It was a poetic way of understanding how cultural practices evolved and persisted, Issa thought, a perspective that bridged the gap between academic analysis and lived experience. As they sat by the spring, she found herself less concerned with documenting every detail for her research, and more interested in understanding the personal meaning these traditions held for Tommy and his community. "Why did you decide to share all this with me?" She finally asked the question that had been lingering since he first offered to show her his town's hidden practices. Most anthropologists who study rural communities never get this kind of access. "Before she died, she told me someone would come who needed to learn what I could teach. Someone who could help preserve our knowledge if anything happened to our community." He looked up at Issa, his expression both vulnerable and determined. "When you arrived asking questions about our harvest festival, something told me you were that person." The responsibility implicit in his words settled heavily on Issa's shoulders. She had come to Redwater Creek seeking material for an academic paper, perhaps a book on rural American traditions. Instead, she was being offered the role of knowledge keeper for practices that had survived against all odds for generations. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," she admitted, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the trust Tommy was placing in her. "I came here as a researcher, not as—" She trailed off, unsure how to define what he seemed to be asking of her. "Sometimes we find our purpose in unexpected places," Tommy replied, echoing words that could have come from his grandmother. "The fact that you're still here, still listening, still trying to understand rather than judge, that tells me something about who you are." The anthropologist in her knew she had discovered something academically significant, living fertility practices that combined elements from multiple cultural traditions, preserved through deliberate adaptation and secrecy in a modern American setting. Such findings could establish her reputation in her field, perhaps even secure the university position she'd been working toward. But publishing her research would inevitably expose Redwater Creek to outside scrutiny, potentially threatening the very traditions she found so valuable. "I don't expect you to become one of us," Tommy said gently, as if sensing her internal conflict. "But I hope you'll help protect what we have here in whatever way makes sense to you." It was a reasonable request, respecting both her outsider status and the responsibility she now felt toward this community that had shared its secrets with her. As they walked back toward town, the morning sun warming their shoulders, Issa began to see a middle path forming, a way to honor both her academic integrity and the trust Tommy and his community had placed in her. Perhaps her research could focus on the broader patterns of cultural preservation and adaptation, the ways rural communities maintained their identities in the modern world, without exposing the specific details that Redwater Creek wished to keep private. Some knowledge, she was beginning to understand, belonged to those who lived it rather than those who merely studied it. Back in town, Issa noticed subtle changes in how the community interacted with her. Women who had been politely distant before now smiled and greeted her warmly. Sheriff Harker nodded respectfully when they passed on the street. Even Pastor Williams seemed to include her in his knowing glances during conversations about the successful harvest festival. She had been accepted, at least provisionally, as someone who understood and respected their ways. In the remaining days of her stay, Isa continued to document what she could, but with a new sensitivity to which elements of Redwater Creek's practices should remain private. Tommy introduced her to other community members who shared specific aspects of the traditions. An elderly blacksmith who created ritual tools with symbols forged into them for strength and virility. A midwife who incorporated the ancient fertility knowledge into her modern practice to ensure healthy births. Young parents who were adapting the old ways to raise their children with both traditional values and contemporary education. What emerged was a picture of a community that had neither abandoned its past nor rejected the present, but instead found ways to integrate both into a cohesive cultural identity. "We're not living in the past," Martha told her over tea one afternoon. "We're carrying the past forward with us, taking what works and leaving what doesn't." It was an approach to tradition that Isa found both intellectually fascinating and personally compelling, honoring ancestral knowledge while allowing it to evolve to meet current needs. As Isa's time in Redwater Creek drew to a close, she faced the question of what to do with everything she had learned. Her notebooks were filled with observations, her camera with images, her mind with experiences that had changed her understanding of how ancient practices could survive in the modern world. On her final evening in town, the community held a small gathering at Mrs. Jenkins' bed and breakfast, not a formal ceremony, but a meal shared among those who had been most involved in showing Isa their traditions. Sheriff Harker was there, his official sternness softened in the informal setting. Martha brought special bread she had baked, shaped in the traditional fertility forms but modified for everyday blessing. Pastor Williams offered a grace that seamlessly blended Christian thankfulness with older reverence for the land's abundance. And Tommy sat beside Isa, their shoulders occasionally touching in a way that acknowledged the connection that had formed between them over the past weeks. "We don't expect you to keep everything secret," Sheriff Harker said directly, as they enjoyed Martha's apple pie for dessert. "We understand you came here to study our ways, but we trust you to protect what needs protecting." Isa nodded, feeling the weight of that trust. "I'll write about the broader patterns, how communities preserve their cultural heritage, how traditions adapt to changing times. The specific details of your practices will remain with you." The relief around the table was palpable, shoulders relaxing and smiles emerging. "And perhaps," Tommy added quietly, "you'll come back for next year's blessing." Redwater Creek looked like any small ranch town in the early morning light. Pickup trucks parked on the main street, the diner opening for breakfast, farmers already heading out to their fields. But Isa now saw the hidden layers beneath this ordinary surface. The symbols carved into porch posts, the specific plants growing in kitchen gardens, the community bonds forged through shared secrets and ancient practices. "Your grandmother would be proud of how you've carried on her work," she told Tommy as they stood beside her loaded car. "Sharing knowledge is how traditions stay alive." He smiled, a mixture of sadness and hope in his expression. "Some traditions need new blood to keep them vital," he replied, the double meaning clear in his words. There was a question in his eyes that went beyond professional interest or academic collaboration, a personal invitation that Isa wasn't quite ready to answer. "I need time to process everything I've learned here," she said honestly, "to figure out how it fits into my understanding of the world and my own path forward." Tommy nodded, accepting her need for space without pulling away emotionally. "The spring will still be here," he said simply, "and so will I." As Isa drove away from Redwater Creek, watching the town recede in her rearview mirror, she knew that whatever academic papers or books might eventually come from her research, the most significant impact of this community would be on her personally, challenging her to see the connection between ancient wisdom and modern life in ways her university training never had. 6 months later, Isa sat in her university office, putting the finishing touches on her paper about cultural preservation in rural American communities. She had found a way to honor both her academic integrity and her promise to Redwater Creek, focusing on the patterns and principles of how traditions evolved and adapted, rather than exposing the specific practices that the community preferred to keep private. Her department chair had been impressed with the theoretical framework she'd developed, even without the sensational details that would have made for more provocative reading. This has implications beyond just rural American communities, he'd commented after reviewing her draft. You're addressing fundamental questions about how cultural knowledge survives in changing environments. Isa felt proud of the work, seeing it as a contribution to anthropological understanding that respected the dignity and agency of the people she had studied. As she saved the final draft and closed her laptop, her eyes fell on the small cloth bag Tommy had given her for protection during the blessing ceremony. She had kept it on her desk as a reminder of everything she had experienced in Redwater Creek, the visible and invisible connections that bound communities together across time, the power of shared beliefs to create meaning and purpose, the ways people found to preserve what mattered most to them, despite outside pressures to conform or abandon their heritage. The spring was calling her back, just as Tommy had predicted it would. She picked up her phone, checking the calendar. The harvest season would be approaching again soon in Redwater Creek. Perhaps it was time to return, not just as a researcher, but as someone seeking her own connection to traditions that honored the fertile cycles of life, death, and renewal that shaped human experience across cultures and throughout history. That evening, as Isa packed her bags for a return visit to Redwater Creek, she reflected on how her perspective had shifted since she first drove into that small ranch town with her academic assumptions and observer's detachment. She had gone there seeking interesting material for her research, expecting to document quaint rural traditions that would illustrate how communities maintained cultural identities in increasingly homogenized modern America. Instead, she had encountered living practices that challenged her understanding of how ancient knowledge could be preserved and adapted, passed down through generations not as fossilized relics, but as evolving traditions that continued to serve vital community needs. The fertility rituals of Redwater Creek weren't simply curious anthropological artifacts. They were functional elements of a thriving cultural ecosystem, binding people to each other and to the land they depended on. As she placed Tommy's protective charm carefully in her travel bag, Isa acknowledged that her return wasn't motivated solely by academic interest. Something about Redwater Creek's approach to tradition had resonated with her on a personal level. The integration of past and present, the honoring of natural cycles, the creation of meaningful community bonds through shared practices and beliefs. She had entered the town as an observer, but would return as a seeker, someone open to learning not just about these traditions but potentially from them. The harvest season was approaching, and with it, the blessing ceremony that had first revealed Redwater Creek's secrets to her. This time she wouldn't be watching from the sidelines with notebook in hand. This time she would participate fully, stepping into the circle to discover what these ancient practices might offer to a modern woman searching for her own connections to something larger than herself.